The message arrived on a quiet afternoon when the house felt too large and too silent. The kind of silence that settles in places where memories outweigh voices. Dolores was seated by the living room window, sunlight spilling across the worn, hardwood floors, the same floors she and her husband had polished by hand decades earlier. Her phone buzzed once, sharp and intrusive. "Borrowed your old ring for the party, Grandma. Hope you don't mind." Dolores stared at the words longer than necessary, her reflection faintly visible on the dark screen, silver hair pinned neatly, posture still proud despite the years. She typed back with calm fingers, the kind of calm learned through endurance, rather than ease. "Have fun, dear." The lie tasted metallic, because the moment she pressed send, something hardened inside her, something that had been soft for far too long. She stood slowly, joints protesting, and walked into the bedroom she had retreated to for years, the one place in the house that still felt like it belonged to her. Behind a framed photograph of her late husband smiling in a Dodgers cap, she opened a concealed safe. Inside rested the truth no one ever bothered to ask about: documents, velvet-lined trays, history measured not in sentiment but in value. She lifted the empty slot where the ring had been and exhaled. Not grief, not fear, clarity. She dialed a number she hadn't needed in a long time. "Frank," she said when the voice answered, steady as stone. "It's time. File a theft report. Inventory item 847. There was a pause, then disbelief. Dolores didn't explain further. She didn't need to. Somewhere across town, chandeliers glittered above a charity gala where a woman who believed herself untouchable raised her hand in laughter, unaware that the story of her night and her life had already been rewritten by the quiet old woman she had underestimated. For 10 years, Dolores had learned how to disappear without leaving the room. It began subtly, the way most erasures do. When her son married Cynthia, the house filled with noise again, heels on tile, perfume too sharp for Dolores's taste, voices that spoke over her instead of to her. At first, Dolores told herself it was an adjustment, a generational thing. But respect doesn't fade overnight. It's chipped away, comment by comment. "Dolores, don't rearrange the cushions," Cynthia would say, smiling thinly. "Dolores, could you keep it down? I have a headache." Soon it wasn't Dolores anymore. It was the old lady. At dinner parties, Cynthia spoke about her as if she were furniture. "She gets confused sometimes," she'd laugh, swirling wine in crystal glasses bought with Dolores's son's money. "You know how age is, and her son's sweet, quiet." Louis would look at his plate, silent, standing in for loyalty. The house that Dolores had filled with love, with scraped knees, and Christmas mornings, slowly became a stage she was asked to exit. She was told which rooms were off limits, when guests were coming, and when it would be better if she stayed upstairs. Nights were the hardest. She'd lie awake listening to laughter echo through walls she once painted by hand, wondering how a home could exile its owner. No one noticed the way she folded inward, how her voice softened to avoid being heard at all. Cynthia never asked. She instructed, and in doing so, she mistook restraint for weakness. What she didn't see, what no one saw, was that Dolores had survived far worse than disrespect. She had survived loss. She had buried the love of her life. She had learned patience not as surrender, but as preparation. Mario had always said that true wealth was best kept quiet. He grew up during a time when showing off invited trouble, when privacy was a form of protection. In their later years, as his health declined, he found comfort in collecting beautiful things, artifacts with stories, craftsmanship with lineage. Dolores watched him carefully examine pieces, his eyes lighting up the way they once did when she entered a room. He never bragged, never explained. He trusted her to understand without words. After he passed, she honored that trust. The collection stayed hidden, catalogued with precision only Frank knew about. Certificates, appraisals, insurance policies, and the ring, the pink diamond, was his favorite. He used to joke that it reminded him of sunsets over the Santa Monica Pier, soft but unforgettable. To the untrained eye, it looked old-fashioned, understated. Cynthia had seen it and dismissed it instantly, her lips curling with that familiar look of superiority. Dolores remembered watching her that morning in the garden, pretending to prune, roses while Cynthia slipped into her bedroom. She saw the moment Cynthia's expression changed, greed flickering behind practiced elegance. When the text came later, Dolores wasn't surprised. She was relieved. Because theft isn't always about objects, it's about entitlement. Cynthia believed the house, the belongings, even Dolores herself were temporary obstacles. That belief was her undoing. As Dolores waited, hands folded in her lap, she imagined the moment the music would stop, the room would go quiet, and reality would arrive dressed in blue uniforms and flashing lights. She felt no joy in it, only justice. And for the first time in a decade, she didn't feel invisible at all. The call from Frank ended just as Dolores heard sirens in the distance, faint at first, then multiplying like consequences, finally catching up. She remained seated, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at the family portrait above the mantel. Mario in his Sunday blazer, Louis as a boy with grass-stained knees, a version of life untouched by ambition or entitlement. The phone rang. Again, this time vibrating with urgency. Louis's name lit up the screen, flashing like a warning. When she answered, his voice cracked through the receiver, breathless and panicked. "Mom, what's happening?" "The police just shut down the gala." Cynthia's crying. "They're saying something about a stolen ring, $3 million. That can't be right." Dolores listened without interruption, her silence heavier than any accusation. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured, almost gentle. "Your wife took something that didn't belong to her, Louis. Something very valuable." He protested, of course. He always did. He said there must be a mistake, that Cynthia thought it was costume jewelry, that no one told them she owned anything worth that kind of money. That was the irony no one ever asked. Dolores ended the call with a sentence that felt like closing a door. "I didn't raise you to excuse theft," she said quietly. Across town, chaos unfolded beneath chandeliers as guests whispered and phones recorded. Cynthia's perfect night fractured into fragments, handbags abandoned, champagne flutes clinking. Nervously, laughter replaced by disbelief. Dolores imagined Cynthia's face when the ring was removed, when authority replaced admiration. She didn't savor it. Satisfaction wasn't the emotion. It was release. For 10 years she had been shrinking to keep peace, mistaking endurance for duty. Now, peace would have to find a new shape, one that didn't require her silence. Frank arrived shortly after, his presence filling the house with the kind of certainty Dolores had missed. He brought with him a man named Patrick, sharp-eyed and observant, someone who noticed details others overlooked. They sat at the dining table, the same table where Dolores had once been told to eat alone during a business dinner, and spread out folders thick with evidence. Patrick spoke carefully, respectfully, as if aware that the truth he carried had weight. "Mrs. Dolores, we've been watching for a while," he said. "You mentioned misplaced items months ago. Jewelry you didn't remember moving. It wasn't your memory." The word struck her harder than any insult Cynthia had ever thrown. For years she had doubted herself, wondered if age was stealing pieces of her mind the way Cynthia had stolen pieces of her life. Patrick slid photographs across the table, grainy images of Cynthia at pawn shops, smiling, lying with ease. Receipts followed. Dates, amounts, a pattern. Small pieces at first, nothing flashy. Enough to go unnoticed. Enough to feed a lifestyle built on appearances. Dolores felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she didn't cry. Fury requires clarity, and clarity she had. "She called me senile," Dolores whispered, more to herself than to them. Frank nodded gravely. "And she planned to use that," he said. "Emails, consultations with attorneys, discussions about incompetence, retirement homes, control." It was never about concern. It was about access. Dolores leaned back in her chair, the weight of betrayal settling deep. She thought of all the times she apologized for misplacing things she never lost, all the moments she felt ashamed for forgetting what was stolen. Cynthia hadn't just taken objects. She had stolen confidence, dignity, truth. And now, the cost of that theft was arriving with interest. When Dolores walked into the hotel lobby an hour later, the air was electric with scandal. Reporters clustered near the entrance, voices overlapping, cameras flashing like judgment. Cynthia sat handcuffed on a leather sofa, her elegance stripped bare. Mascara streaked her cheeks, her posture collapsed inward, the ring no longer adorning her hand. Louis stood nearby, anger and confusion wrestling on his face. He saw his mother and froze. "You have to fix this," he said, desperation bleeding into accusation. Dolores met his gaze steadily. "This isn't broken," she replied. "It's exposed." Detective Garcia approached, professionalism tempered with curiosity. Dolores confirmed what needed no embellishment, no permission had been given. The ring was registered, the theft real. When Patrick presented the additional evidence, the room seemed to tilt. Louis's world cracked open as he realized the truth had been standing quietly beside him for years. Cynthia pleaded then, her voice high and frantic, claiming misunderstandings, love, family. Dolores listened, then spoke words she had rehearsed silently for a decade. "Respect isn't something you claim when you're caught," she said. "It's something you practice when no one is watching." When the detective asked if she wished to press charges, Dolores didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice calm, unshaking. As Cynthia was led away, screaming about ruined reputations and betrayal, Dolores felt an unfamiliar sensation bloom in her chest. It wasn't revenge. It was recognition. For the first time in years, the world saw her not as an obstacle, not as an inconvenience, but as a woman who knew her worth and finally demanded it. The lobby slowly emptied as Cynthia was taken away, her cries echoing briefly before dissolving into the night, but the damage lingered like smoke after a fire. Dolores stood near the marble column where wedding parties once posed for photos, feeling the weight of eyes on her, curious, judgmental, sympathetic, impressed. Louis sat heavily in a chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if answers might be hiding in the pattern of the carpet. "I didn't know," he said again, his voice breaking under the repetition. Dolores watched her son the way only a mother can, seeing both the man he had become and the boy he used to be, the one who once ran into her arms after a bad dream. "You knew how she treated me," Dolores replied softly, "not with cruelty, but with truth. You saw it, and you stayed quiet." The words landed hard, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable. Silence, Dolores had learned, could be louder than shouting. Detective Garcia returned with updates, explaining that additional charges were being filed, that Cynthia's past activities were now under deeper investigation. As the legal language filled the air, Dolores felt strangely detached, as if watching a movie unfold about someone else's life. Yet every detail traced back to moments she remembered: missing jewelry, whispered conversations, suggestions that she was forgetting things. It all fit together now with brutal clarity. When they finally left the hotel, the night air felt cooler, cleaner. Louis offered to stay with her, his voice tentative, unsure of his place. For the first time in years, he was asking rather than assuming. Dolores nodded. "We'll talk tomorrow," she said. "Tonight, you need to sit with what you've learned." As they drove home, city lights streaked past the windows, and Dolores realized something profound. She was no longer afraid of losing her son. What she feared now was losing herself again, and that was something she would never allow. Morning arrived quietly, sunlight filtering through curtains that hadn't been disturbed by shouting or demands. Dolores sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee Louis had made without being asked. The simple act felt monumental. "I keep thinking about everything I ignored," Louis said, his voice low, ashamed. "Every time Cynthia joked about your memory, every time she said you should move out." Dolores listened, not interrupting. Accountability, she knew, only mattered when it wasn't rushed. The phone rang mid-conversation. It was Frank, his tone serious. "They found more," he said. What followed stunned even Dolores. A hidden room, stolen art, jewelry belonging to other families, connections across state lines. The woman who had ridiculed Dolores's ugly antiques had been running a quiet empire of theft from the very house she called outdated. FBI agents arrived by afternoon, methodical and respectful, explaining how Cynthia had leveraged social access, charity events, and perceived trust to exploit others. Dolores watched Louis's face drain of color as realization struck. His marriage hadn't just been a mistake, it had been a blindfold. When the agents left, the house felt heavier, filled with truths that could no longer be ignored. "How do we move forward?" Louis asked, voice barely above a whisper. Dolores placed a hand over his. "By choosing honesty over comfort," she said. Every time, that evening, news vans parked outside. Headlines spread. Interviews were requested. Dolores agreed to speak, not for attention, but for purpose. If her story could prevent even one person from being dismissed, from being erased, then it was worth telling. As cameras rolled and microphones hovered, Dolores stood taller than she had in years. She wasn't reclaiming power. She was reclaiming presence. The press conference changed everything. Dolores spoke not as a victim, but as a witness to her own endurance, to the quiet ways abuse hides behind respectability. She watched faces shift as she described being slowly erased in her own home, of doubting her memory while someone exploited that doubt. Calls poured in afterward, women, men, voices trembling with recognition. Stories of missing heirlooms, of pressure to sign papers, of being told age had made them irrelevant. Dolores answered each call with patience, offering what she had learned the hard way. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Never let anyone convince you that your worth has an expiration date. Louis filed for divorce days later, grief and relief tangled together. "I chose peace over truth," he admitted one night. "And it cost us years," Dolores nodded. "Peace that demands silence isn't peace," she said. Weeks passed. Cynthia's sentence was handed down years behind bars, restitution ordered. When Cynthia called from prison months later, her voice stripped of arrogance, Dolores listened. She heard envy, regret, the confession of a woman who mistook dominance for strength. When the call ended, Dolores felt no triumph, only closure. She had survived not by fighting loudly, but by refusing to disappear. One evening, sitting alone in the garden she had tended for decades, Dolores reflected on the strange beauty of resilience. Being underestimated had been her shield, patience had been her weapon, and self-respect rediscovered at 71 had become her legacy. She smiled to herself, knowing the final truth Cynthia would never escape. The woman she tried to erase had become impossible to ignore. A year passed, and with it came a life Dolores never imagined would begin in her 70s. The mornings no longer felt heavy, they felt intentional. Her days filled with voices, real voices, not commands or dismissals but conversations. The program that began as a single interview evolved into a nationally watched show, a place where older Americans finally felt seen. Dolores didn't sit under studio lights pretending to be a celebrity. She sat the way she always had, back, straight, eyes steady, voice warm with authority earned through survival. People listened because she wasn't selling hope. She was proving it existed. Letters arrived by the hundreds, then thousands. Some were handwritten on lined paper, others typed shakily by grandchildren at kitchen tables. Stories of stolen pensions, manipulated wills, quiet humiliation echoed her own in heartbreaking detail. Dolores read every one. She responded to as many as she could. With Frank's help, she created a foundation that funded legal protection and education for seniors who had been told they were too old to matter. Louis rebuilt his life slowly, painfully, and honestly. He apologized not once, but often, learning that remorse wasn't a single moment, it was consistent action. When he introduced Dolores to Nicole, the woman who would later become his wife, Dolores noticed the difference immediately. Nicole asked questions and waited for answers. She listened without interrupting. She respected the past instead of trying to erase it. At their wedding, held in the same garden Cynthia once wanted to demolish, Dolores stood as matriarch, surrounded by laughter that didn't require her absence. She thought of Mario then, imagined his hand on her shoulder, his quiet pride. Cynthia faded into memory, not forgiven, not hated, simply irrelevant. The greatest shift wasn't public recognition or financial security. It was internal. Dolores no longer explained herself. She no longer shrank. She understood that dignity isn't granted, it's claimed. And age, she learned, wasn't a liability. It was a ledger, filled with lessons, resilience, and the unshakable clarity of someone who has survived enough to finally choose herself. On a quiet evening much like the one where it all began, Dolores sat by the window again, watching dusk settle over the neighborhood she had called home for decades. The house felt different now, not louder, not grander, just honest. She thought about how close she had come to disappearing completely, how easily silence can become a prison when it's mistaken for peace. Cynthia had believed power was something taken from others, something worn like jewelry and displayed for admiration. Dolores now knew better. Power was the ability to stand still while the world tried to push you aside and remain. It was knowing when patience was wisdom and when it was surrender. It was recognizing that respect does not come from age, money, or position, but from the boundaries you refuse to let anyone cross. She hoped anyone hearing her story understood this truth deeply. You are never too old to matter, never too quiet to be dangerous, never too late to reclaim your life. The world often overlooks those who don't demand attention, but underestimation is not invisibility, it's opportunity. Dolores smiled as the sky darkened, content in the knowledge that her voice now lived far beyond the walls of her home, carried by others who had found courage in her example. And if there was one lesson she wished to leave behind, it was this: never allow anyone to convince you that your worth fades with time, because the moment you believe that lie is the moment you give someone else permission to erase you. The real question is not how much you can endure, but how long you'll wait before you decide you deserve better.